Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. All right, so what we're going to start talking about today is the creation of trade routes, which is actually a lot cooler than it sounds. And then we're going to start getting into more specific cultures. And then as the unit progresses, we're going to start talking about really cool wars and situations that happen. It progressively just keeps getting cooler the further you get into it. All right. So today we're going to start out by talking about development of trade routes. So let me get myself in the right size. All right. So the development of trade routes are very important to the growth of civilizations. So you have these different groups far away from each other, sometimes near each other. They are going to start trading with each other, and people realize, hey, this is really cool. That town has something I don't have that they can grow, and I have something that they don't have, so we can trade with each other, and both our towns can have both things, but we only focus on growing our one thing, or having our one thing, or making our one thing. So trade is extremely important. It doesn't take, I was going to say it doesn't take long, it takes thousands of years for these trade routes to develop, but everybody knows they want to trade with people far away, all right? Now, one of the very first trade routes, and I'll show you some pictures here, so you don't have to look at words, is this thing called the Silk Road. Now, this is China, right in here. All right. China has something the rest of the world wants, and pretty much up to modern day, they're the only ones who had it, and it was silk. Now, silk is extremely important and extremely sought after. It was extremely expensive. It was very hard to get. So silk is like, cloth, like silk. You know what silk is. My tie is probably made out of some imitation silk. They couldn't make imitation silk back then. It might actually be silk. I don't know. So the only place on earth to get silk was China. Now, only rich people could afford it, because it was extremely expensive, but everybody wanted it, especially if you live in a hot climate, because your options are like animal fur for clothing or wool, which is just shearing a sheep. By the way, you don't kill a sheep in order to get the wool off of it. Just want to throw that out there. Every now and then I have somebody who, somebody will ask that in class. I usually have about 20% of the class doesn't know that. So if you knew that and you're like, who thought that? Don't worry about it. If you're one of those 20% that think you have to kill a sheep to get the wool off of it, you don't. You give it a haircut and the wool grows back. And sheep are very good for wool. And your clothes are made out of wool. Wool is great in the wintertime when it's cold. But if it's really hot, it is awful. Cotton isn't a thing yet. We'll talk about later on in this course when cotton starts becoming popular. When cotton becomes popular, we'll talk about it later on. Wool, however, is the standard for a very long time. People want silk. It's light, it's airy, it's breathable, it's great. Can only get it from China. Well, China, all right, they're like, where are you getting silk from? China's like, don't worry about it. For like thousands of years, nobody knows where the silk comes from. They're like, is there a silk plant? China's like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So for thousands of years, China makes a lot of money off of the silk trade. All over the world, people come to China to get silk, and China will ship it across the world to places and sell it for a ton of money. And these lines from China, all the way, this is India, and then Europe, where we've been talking about. This is Mesopotamia right here, where we'd already been talking about. All right. Let me move myself back a little bit. You got Europe over here. All these lines, sea routes. You got the Silk Road connects the whole world because everybody wants silk. You know where silk it comes from? Worms. Yeah, I don't really know how that works, but worms make silk. They're called the silkworm, and China held on to that secret for like longer than any secret known to man that I'm aware of, on not letting those silkworms get out, not even letting people know where they came from. And they would like breed and make silk. I don't know if it's like a thread that you put together in silk or how exactly it works. It'd be a quick Google right now that I haven't done. But yeah, so silk, everybody wanted it. And so the Silk Road is the name for this vast connection with China that had a lot of people in a lot of country areas that really spread around the known world at the time for silk and then other goods as well. All right. So the Silk Road, very famous trade routes. Another one, all right, is going to be the Appian Way. Now, I put this big blank map up here so you can know what we're talking about. So we were way over here. This is Europe, all right? Nothing's here. We are going to focus here on Rome, and we're going to start talking about the development of Rome here today. So Rome here is at the bottom of the screen, all right? And there we go. And so once you look at that, here is another big trade route. So Rome, by the end of this unit, Rome's going to be like the big player. All right. Rome is kind of a boot, and the boot sticks out into the middle of the Mediterranean. So a lot of shipping comes in here, but Rome, the city, is way up here. So a lot of stuff that could get made in Rome would have to get traveled down their trade route called the Appian Way out here to get put on boats. Stuff would come from boats and have to get marched all the way up the Appian Way to Rome. So the Silk Road and Appian Way, probably two of the most famous trade routes that existed. All right, now the next one is the Phoenicians. All right, and this is specifically going to ask you this question here. On your notes, it was like, what's a major contribution of the Phoenicians? So the Phoenicians, where they lived, it was a civilization right here, all right, in the green spot. This is Byblos, Sidon, Tyre. These are, I probably mispronounced all those, honestly. So this little green spots is where the Phoenicians are. Now, the Phoenicians were really good at sailing, but a lot of people were. And they would sail all around, here, there, all over the place. So the Phoenicians, they invented something, and it was such a fantastic idea that all of these civilizations around here are going to start stealing it. Now, little spoiler alert here as we get through further today. This is the Mediterranean Sea. We're going to spend a lot of our time in history talking about the development of civilizations here. More over here to the right, all right, off the screen here to the right, that is where Mesopotamia is. Once civilization started coming over here and realizing all these rivers here will allow for civilizations, nobody's drinking the Mediterranean Sea water, but you can sail across the Mediterranean Sea and connect with all these different civilizations and be able to trade, and it's fantastic. So the Phoenicians, though, all right, they weren't really anything special, just a normal civilization, but they invented the alphabet. All right. Now that may not seem like, okay, cool, glad they did that. Think about that, is they came up with, like, and it's what our alphabet is today. It's the Phoenician alphabet, more or less. They came up with a number of letters. I don't know if it was the same as ours are today, or if they had some extra ones, and probably had some extra ones. But when you decided to write a word, instead of drawing a picture of it, you just sounded it out with each individual sound. This is fantastic. You can use the same language or the same alphabet, because they make the same human sounds, across different languages. And it helps you be able to translate stuff without having to memorize pictures in every single different language of what they mean. The Phoenicians had this idea of the way they wrote things down was phonetically. Is where it comes from, the words Phoenician. Like if you're going to spell it phonetically, then you would write it down how it sounds. Like phone, if you spelled phone phonetically, you would spell it F-O-N-E. Funny enough, if you spelled Phoenicians phonetically, it would start with an F and not a PH. Interesting how that works. But being able to sound things out and spell them is great. If there's a new word and you don't know what the picture is, you can just use those symbols for the sounds to be able to write it. The whole world is going to adopt, or the vast majority will adopt some concept of that from the Phoenicians. And you can see with these red lines, these are where they traded at. And so many people are like, that is a fantastic idea. So we still see that in our culture today from the Phoenicians, and their lasting contribution was the alphabet. And it really changes communication, because now you can spell new words without having to all get together and decide like what this picture is. Like you invent something new, you just give it a name and you spell it phonetically. You don't have to make a new picture. Imagine inventing something new and then trying to explain it to everybody using a picture of something they have no idea what it is. So this is a really cool idea, and we still see it today, and they get spread along throughout these trade routes. And that's the question here, is what's the major contribution and how does it change communication? We talked about that. Make sure you answer that in full sentences. As always, pause me if you need to. All right. So as we start getting into more specific societies here, all right, there is a ranking in society among people in social differences. So gender between male and female. So only recently has there been a common focus in society on equality between men and women. Now, the reason I say that is equality means men and women do the same things and the same jobs. That is a big push in modern society because we have the ability to be able to do that now. All right. And before there's a big push for equality, there was like a ranking where like men were above women. That is actually not common either. So throughout history, equal is not super common, and having clear-cut men are superior to women and women have to ask permission from men and women are subservient to men is actually not as common throughout history either. The Native Americans, I like the way they explained it the most, and a lot of civilizations until modern 1,000 years, the first few thousand years, it wasn't so much equality between men and women as it was this idea of balance. All right. Men had their own set of jobs that they were supposed to deal with for society. And then women also had 50% that they had to deal with to make society function. And the balance worked together to make a functioning society. All right. That was more common. So saying equal, like, are they of equal importance in society? Yes. A lot of times it was. As far as do they have the same job requirements? No, not at all. Are they respected equally into society? Most societies, yes. All right. But were women allowed to be leaders? Absolutely not. Very, very, very few civilizations was that it. And by today's standards, seeing all these things that women weren't allowed to do really makes them seem a lot more backwaters than maybe they were. But there's a lot of things that men wouldn't be able to do. But then again, you know, how many men are like, oh, I really wish I could go out there and raise the children, versus how many women are like, oh, I wish I could go be a leader. There's probably a lot more women who felt restricted by their requirements in society than there were as men, but it wasn't a subservient role. We are going to see that a lot in especially Christian Europe, about 1700s especially, that women were supposed to be inferior and be like a servant to men. And we do see that, and that is a lot of what we break out of in our modern society and try to come up with equality where men and women take the same roles in a modern society where that's completely plausible and functioning. So a lot of it was more based on balance, but there were definitely different roles in male and female. Men were supposed to go outside the household and provide for the household. Whatever the household needed to survive, the man has to leave the house and go do it. Women were in charge of keeping the household running in whichever way that they agreed it was supposed to be doing, whether that's raising children. If there were slaves, and we'll talk about slaves here in a second, women were in charge of the slaves, of making sure that they did what they're supposed to, and all the stuff that would take place in a homestead, women were in charge of it. Men were required to leave the homestead to go provide for whatever takes place in the homestead. That was the general, across most civilizations was like that. But it wasn't one was necessarily ranked higher than the other. Without one of those, without the man or the woman, the complete system falls apart. And that's why there was more of a focus on balance than there was equality, which does mean two different things. Landed gentry. There's a million complicated words for landed gentry. All right. So I just picked one. It's the people that own the land, the people that control the land. These are the small percentage of the wealthy people who controlled land. Whoever controlled land controlled society. Because, again, all of this was based off of the fact that there's plenty of food. Whoever controls the land that food is grown on also controls society. So wealthy people typically own the land and then let poor people work their land in exchange for eating some of the food that they grew, and the rest of it goes to the wealthy person who just makes money not having to do anything. That is very common, whether it's called nobles, whether it's called lords, whether it's called whatever it is in whichever society. Landed gentry is just a term for the people who control the land. There are peasants in every society as well. These are poor people. Let me show you a little graph here. Again, always going back to Egypt. There's so much on Egypt because it was one of the longest lasting ones. So you got peasants. These are typically your lowest class or your lower class that are just working for whatever wealthy person is job they're giving them. A lot of times they're the unskilled workers that are doing stuff. And then there's going to be slaves in society. Most societies, and since the farming revolution, most means over 50% have had slaves of some sort. Now, let me be very clear when I say the word slave in America. The way that America dealt with slaves, with it being a specific race, for the 99.9999% was a certain race, and the fact they were owned for life, they had no control over it. That is probably one of the top 1% most extreme versions of slavery that had ever existed. The complete and total ownership of a human being from the time they are born to the time they die, and there's no options in between, is an extremely extreme version of slavery. All right? So slavery means you're owned by somebody else, and you have to do whatever they tell you to do. That is not uncommon throughout the history of societies, but the American way that it ended up being in the 1800s with African Americans in the South, specifically for farm work and all that, is a relatively extreme version of slavery. All right, most slaves were not originally born slaves. The vast majority were not born slaves. They either chose themselves to turn it, like you have so many debts you can't pay it. It's either go to prison or I'm going to be your slave. And they'll choose, sometimes it's for a certain amount of years. I have to be your slave for 10 years until my debt is paid. That was common. If you're a warrior in a battle that you lose, you become a slave, maybe for life, depending on, it would depend. But if you had kids, if you're a slave and you had kids, they beat you in battle. They don't own your kids. Like, that's crazy talk. So slavery existed very commonly throughout history. The vast majority of societies, I would say, at some point had slavery at some point. But don't equate slavery with the relatively extreme version that America went with it in the 17 and 1800s, because the whole you're owned for life and then your children are just born into it there were other places that did that on earth throughout history, but it was not common. Most societies had slaves, but it was either a choice or they were sold there by a family member. Like, oh, I owe a bunch of money. What can I do? I'm going to sell my kid to you. Like, that type of stuff happened. But it's usually for a certain amount of time until a debt is paid. Or even if you're there for life, your children aren't automatically slaves themselves. That's a different person. So, yes, slavery existed in almost all these societies, but it was different than the relatively hyper extreme version that America implemented. So don't confuse slavery as being the same across time and place. All right. So the question here is what makes the makeup of the majority of ancient societies is going to be the poor people, whether it's slaves or peasants. And like, why do you think that is? So again, you got to answer these in full sentences. So wealthy people control the society. If there's too many wealthy people, there's not enough wealth to go around. So the wealthy people design societies so that there's a lot of poor people so that they can have people do their work for them. It's just how societies end up being designed. A lot of it's human nature as the way of what people will accept and deal with security, and there's a whole more complex. You'll talk about this in another course with civics and economics, about how people give up rights to gain security and things like that. But the wealthy people are always the minority but control society, and the vast majority are made up of poor people and slaves, because society can't function without workers. So that's the question, and we had already talked about that. All right, so the rise of Greece. I want to get started and explain some Greece to you because starting tomorrow or in our next lesson, we're going to talk super awesome about some of the wars and stuff that happened in Greece. So Greece is going to come out and become the first real modern society that we in America today can connect to historically. All right. Let me point this out. All right. So you got yourself a map here. Here is where Greece is. All right. You got the Mediterranean Sea. All right. And here is Greece. So Greece is kind of smack dab in the middle of all these civilizations that live here on the edges of the water. So there's a lot of rivers that flow into the Mediterranean Sea. So there's a lot of places for people to live all around this area. All right. They also like living on the coast because it's easy to travel and trade. Greece is kind of the center hub. This is why Greece becomes so much more well known and so much more dominant than the other areas in the region. At first, because of their central location. There's so many people that want to come trade here and do all this other stuff here in Greece, and Greece kind of becomes the hub of everything. Not only that, Greece focuses on education. If you have a good idea, like the Phoenicians have a great idea. Guess what? Greece is going to take it. All right, they're going to handpick the great ideas from these other cultures and make, really, we look back on it as a pretty superior culture. It's pretty impressive. Now, Greece also has a whole different type of society. They're going to have a direct democracy. Prior to this, the vast majority of all civilizations had like a king, like one guy that made all the decisions. Greece is going to have a democracy. And here's why. In order for Greece to be able to defend themselves, they had to create a new style of combat called the phalanx, which is a whole bunch of people that all packed together. I'll come back to this picture in a second. This is a phalanx. Doesn't take a lot of armor, all right? And you have your whole community come in and they train in these military formations and they have to go very tightly together. This military formation, absolutely dominant. Couldn't nobody mess with it. It'd wreck shop on anybody. Anybody comes to try to mess with Greece, they like blow a horn. Everybody comes out of their houses. They create a phalanx, just destroy people. Now, in other countries, they'd have like knights, maybe a king, like 10 guys show up. You ain't messing with a phalanx like this. You're just not. So, here's what's different about Greece. In order to have a phalanx, you have to have all the regular people in it. There's nobody in charge of a phalanx. I mean, there might be one guy's making the calls, but everybody is equal in combat. So when you have to trust your man next to you all the time in combat, and he's equal with you, that's the mentality in Greece, is that everybody is equal. So when it comes down to creating a government in Greece, they really focus on this idea of equality and the ability to vote on everything. So there wasn't like one dictator that made the decisions. If they had a question, they came up and everybody respected their neighbors because you have to fight next to them in combat. So his opinion matters just as much as mine does. So the creation of the phalanx is going to make Greece a whole new style of government nobody's ever seen before, called a democracy, meaning that these people vote and run society as a collective group. All right. And it's going to be a game changer for a long time in this region because you have a very powerful country and all the people are committed to it. In this idea, which is called a direct democracy. So the questions are going to be what allowed Greece to become so much more dominant than surrounding areas in ancient times. There's multiple things you could talk about with the creation of the phalanx, with them being able to fight more effectively. You could talk about them having a direct democracy, allowing more people to have control over their own society and the direction of their society. Or you could talk about their location. I mean, location is key here. The fact that people can travel all over the place and come there and meet there. And they're the center hub. You can't avoid Greece. If you're going to trade, you go to Greece and do your trading in Greece. All right. And then this here, architecture. This is still standing today. This is a present picture. This was thousands of years ago when this was built. This building is called the Parthenon. And this is like their Congress building where they would meet and discuss here in a city of Athens that we'll pick up more on tomorrow. Their architecture are these columns here. Columns were very common in Greek culture. So if you have columns or anything on your house, that is really a reflection of the art and the type of architecture that was used in Greece. So that's as far as we're going to get today in the lesson. I will see you guys tomorrow. Cool stuff to talk about tomorrow.